So our plan now is to have a discussion with a wonderful panel. First, and I think we can say foremost, is Susanna Styron, who this film represents a long period, may I say lifetime, a professional lifetime of putting into film stories from all dimensions, be they about medical issues, health issues, visualizations of fiction, and clearly, I think from this, helping place a mirror up to the lives we share together and our history. And we're just really honored to have you here and to be able to have you in this room as we discuss the film. So Susanna is this is going to be like the old game, What's My Line? If you, Susanna, would, yes, panelist number 1. Panelist number 2 is Timothy Hinton, who is a longtime member of this congregation, the Chapel of the Cross. Timothy is a professor of philosophy at North Carolina State University. We need a philosopher here to help us excavate this film. Tim is also a native of South Africa, where he participated in the anti-apartheid movement, one of whose signal moments was to engage the nation in a quest for truth and reconciliation. And that's a theme that we are going to be exploring in the panel. How do we shine light and give voice to things that have been hidden and sequestered? And do that not only personally, as we've seen Jan do, but do it communally. And Tim has direct experience with that. So Tim, thank you and welcome. We're really delighted to have, yes, you may. And our third panelist is Father Keith Esposito, Associate Rector of the Chapel of the Cross. It's been with us since 2022, and he's a native of New England and has spent time as a Peace Corps volunteer in Ukraine, another place that is contending with history and the need to confess and ask for reconciliation. And we're delighted to have, as we sit here in a church that has its own distinctive moments of racial shame and pride, to have a member of our clergy staff here. So thank you for being here, Father Keith. And you may applaud Father Keith. And my name is David Dodson. I'm a member of this parish. I'm a member of our parish racial healing committee, which is dedicated to shining light on our history and identifying and parsing our truth so that we can live in the future clear about who we are, the work we need to do, and less burdened by the things we know and the things we might think we know that aren't so. And I should also say that my professional work for many years was working across the South to help our region deal with the unfinished business of becoming a place where all people can live with dignity and equity. So this film speaks deeply to issues that I confronted in my work. So this is our panel, and here's how we're going to work. We're going to have Susanna talk in response to a couple of questions for about 10 minutes just to prime the pump. Then Tim is going to do the same for 5 minutes, Father Keith for 5 minutes. Then we're going to have a short kind of conversation among the panelists for themes that come up. And then we're going to open this up for your questions and comments. So the goal is to be interactive with some prompts from the folks up here. Now, I know I've seen the film a number of times, and I know that things are bubbling for us. So before we go right into the panel, I'd like for us to take a little time. If you're an introvert, you can do this yourself quietly. You can put up your eye and say, introvert, don't need to talk with somebody. Or if you'd like to talk with someone, but just turn to a neighbor or turn inward to yourself and say, what's coming up for you as you think about what you've just seen? What emotions or thoughts come to mind? Just to get some of this out so we can breathe. And then I'd ask you to be mindful of those as you listen to the panel. And if you feel you'd like to bring forward some of those thoughts after you've heard the panel talk, you are warmly invited to do so. But let's take a moment before the panel starts just for you to think and talk about what surfaced for you, what you're thinking and feeling, and what got lifted up. Okay? And then in about 3 minutes, we'll come and start the panel. Thanks. Okay, folks, that is just a little priming of the pump. So we're going to begin the panel with a chance to hear from Susanna, and I think some of the questions that are probably on all our mind are these: How did this film come to be? How did you connect with Jan? So just some of the background. How did you stumble into, unearth this extraordinary story?
So it was during the pandemic, and I had been working on a film about a sort of a trailblazing feminist, an unsung hero of the feminist movement, who had recently died. She had a big obituary in the New York Times, and she happened to have grown up in Duck Hill, and I had to abandon that project like the year before. I wasn't working on it anymore. But Jan was doing research, as she said, after George Floyd's murder. It all came up for her again, and she started doing some more research, and now she had the internet available, and she came across, the woman's name was Roxy Bolton. She came across Roxy's obituary, and she saw Duck Hill, and there was a story which I had heard when I was making the film, but I could never get anywhere with, because Roxy had already died and nobody else seemed to know about this, that as a child in Duck Hill, she had witnessed a lynching, and it was one of the things that made her become an activist. And she was also a civil rights, a champion for civil rights, but she focused mostly on women's issues. So Jan did her detective work and found Roxy's son, and Roxy's son said, I don't know anything about this, but maybe Susanna Styron does. She was making a film about my mother. So he gave her my email address, and I just got an email one day from this stranger saying, I'm wondering if you have any more information about the Duck Hill lynching, because my father was one of the perpetrators of it. And I just, my head almost exploded. I was so stunned by that. And so I got in touch with her and I said, I'm sorry, I can't help you. I know about the lynching, but I couldn't get anywhere with it because Roxy had never talked about it to anyone I interviewed. But your story's incredible, and I wonder if we could talk a little more about it. So we did, and we met on Zoom, and when I realized how much of a story there was there, I recorded a Zoom interview with her, and I used that with archival footage that I could get from the internet to cut together a little reel that I could use to raise money. But what captivated me about the story was actually, I have to admit, not about what she was struggling with about race and the specific act that her father had committed, but the emotional undercurrent of the idea of finding out something so horrible about somebody you love so much, and what do you do with that? And how do you reconcile that? But of course it couldn't live independently of the context that it happened in. So then, the story spread out from there, and I raised the money, and then I finally was able to meet her in person a year later when the pandemic simmered down.
A happy, serendipitous series of important accidents. So I think what strikes me, why this film is so powerful for me, is the many levels at which it operates. There is Jan's story of having to confront a hideous truth about a loved one, and how she cannot abandon this person she loved. She seeks to understand. I mean, it's a mystery. The shroudedness. There's a communal history, the healing or lack thereof in Duck Hill, and then there's the broader social context. All of these veils, all of these silences operate at so many levels, and I think a great deal of the power comes in that, in helping us see those layers, feel those layers. The question I want to ask is then about you and about Jan, going back to the personal. What was it like for you to make this film? And then I'm going to ask you, what do you think it was like for Jan? Help us begin by understanding the people at the core.
Yeah, it's a very good question because we went through a lot together. It turned out we were sort of like-minded souls. That was a very happy element of it, that we were able to connect so well and kind of had the same desires and the same intentions. She was unbelievably open and flexible for a documentary subject. She was completely unguarded, and she just wanted to go anywhere I needed her to go, even if it was painful, even if it was shameful, even if it was very, very difficult. But you know, she was already obviously confronting her unconscious racism. And I kind of had a shadow experience with her where, as I made the film, I started recognizing my own blind spots in that area. And it wasn't just listening to Jan and going, oh, I wonder if I'm like that. It was actually the process of making the film and deciding what goes in and what goes out and how to approach it. And the first thing I did once I realized I was going to really make this film was I brought Connie, who you saw back there, on as executive producer, because I realized that I had to have a black partner on it, that being a white person making a story about a white person in the context of atrocities committed against black people, like, I didn't, you know, there was all sorts of stuff I didn't think of, I didn't understand. I needed that perspective. So Connie and I go way, way, way back. We've been very close for many decades, and we can say anything to each other. So I knew that she could, you know, be as hard on me as she needed to, or as clear, you know, just like slap me upside the head when I wasn't seeing something, and I would be very receptive and grateful, because that's what we were trying to do together. And little things like, I also hired a black editor who did the first pass of the film, and she had to go take another job, and I decided to just finish editing it myself. But her perspective was really important. And like, for instance, when I did that first reel that I cut together myself, when she's reading the letter at the beginning, and I'm descended from people who stopped the hearts and all that, I used footage of the Klan. There was some really good, spooky, like, bad guy footage, you know, the boogeyman of the Klan. And it was very dramatic, and music, and Jasmine got in there and she said, I'm taking this out. You can't blame this on the Klan. They are always, you know, it wasn't them. Well, first of all, I knew, and I was like taking poetic license, I knew it wasn't the Klan that did it, but it was like metaphorical. But she said, it was regular people. Like, stop, you know, taking the focus off by using Klan. And I was like, oh, duh. But I hadn't thought of that before. And with Jan, an interesting thing happened with Jan, where she kind of got to another level of her own assumption, kind of automatic assumptions. Was she told me, when she told me the story, she told me that 2 black men had gone in and killed this relative of theirs. So, you know, I went to interview her, which she told the story on film, and she had the not the original papers, but she had, copies she'd gotten from the archives of all the original articles from the local newspapers. And so I got copies from her, and I took them home with me. And I went through them, and I went, what do you mean? How do they know two black men do it? There were no witnesses. And I said that to her. I said, and she had read these reports, but her uncle told her it was two black men, and so that was the story that she got. And she looked at it and she went, oh my God. She couldn't believe that she had done that all these years. And I said, yeah, it could have been two white men. It could have been one white man. It could have been two white women, although that is highly unlikely. But anyway, it was like, wow. So then we did another interview, and where she addressed that in a different way. And also, she said, in the first interview, she was really protecting her uncle. She was saying, they grew up in the South, then it was the way it was. And so when I came back for the second interview, I said, I have some hard questions for you, and they might make you uncomfortable, and are you okay if we do that on film? And she was like, yes, whatever it takes. And so I confronted her about that. I said, aren't you letting them off the hook? I mean, I didn't want to put words in her mouth. I don't even think I used that because I wanted her to get to that herself. But I sort of guided her in that direction until she went, I'm letting them off the hook. That's it's not okay. So that was another level for her. So wow. That's, we very much went through those layers together.
Wow, thank you. I want to ask one last question, and it's still at this personal level, because I think Jan is such a figure it's my father's name, I own this. And she is just so powerful and candid. So there's a wonderful Quaker writer. Some people in this room, I think, know him, Parker Palmer, who's written a lot about courage and identity. And in an article that he wrote for a very different purpose that he calls Divided No More, he says that often powerful change begins when a person decides to stop living a divided self. And when that person can connect with another who is on the same journey, and they make common cause, and then go public with that confession. The ideas of integrity. Integrity means integrate. The divided self comes together. That really can spark change. So when I think, I've always been deeply moved by that idea of change comes when people decide to stop living a divided self. All of us, in some ways, live divided selves. And Jan, it seems to me's awakening is, I am living a divided self. I've got to figure out how to reconcile that for myself. And then, and it's a really critical part in Parker Palmer's thinking, I can't just hold this alone. I have to go public with it. But that doesn't spark anything. It somehow falls short, because it seems she was met with overwhelming silence, this shroud of silence that was more powerful than her desire and her efforts to voice this division. Does any of that resonate? I think she's, and Parker Palmer called this the Rosa Parks moment, when a person says, I can't take this anymore. I can't live with this anymore, and I either collapse back into denial or silence, or I have to voice it. That's what I take away from this, is somebody who manifests the courage for themselves of not wanting to live a divided self, and then says, but that's not enough. I have to take it one step far. Does that
Yeah, I mean, that's what she did, but I think she would say that the being met with the shroud of silence was not the thing. Like she said, she just needed to do it. She didn't have a need or an expectation. She wasn't asking forgiveness. She wasn't, looking for absolution. She was needing to say something that was true. And she said, I didn't get, because, in the paper, nobody ever responded. I mean, it was pretty well buried in there, but also it's a black newspaper, and there people might have gone, I don't care about you, white person, what you had to feel about your father. But she said, I didn't need it. I didn't do it to get an answer. I did it. I had needed to say it because it was true. So I think the first part of that for her is that's what happened. And the second part was okay with her. Then as it so happened, I came along and made it more public, and it was not met with silence. She's gotten a lot of feedback and a lot of conversations, and she has done a few. She's very reclusive, and she's done a few virtual Q&As at screenings in the past 6 months. But it got to be too much for her, and also I think going through it again. It was very gratifying that people wanted to have those conversations with her, but I don't think she's going to do any more. But it's very meaningful to her and her brother. Her brother is over the moon about this. I didn't include him in the film because his memory is not great. So and I thought about it, and I realized when he couldn't remember a lot of it that it wasn't going to be very helpful, even though he's a wonderful guy and he cared so much. But also, I decided I just made an artistic decision too, that I wanted a one-person story. It was just the small focus of it.
Well, thank you for taking what was a private decision not to live a divided self and helping make it more public. Because that's the way I think we can enter into that conversation and question ourselves. So more to come. Thank you, Susanna. I do have cheat notes here. Father Keith. So, we're showing this film in a church which, for those of you who don't know this place, the little chapel, which was the origin point of this congregation, was constructed with bricks made by enslaved people who belonged to the first minister of the church, who was also a professor of rhetoric at the University of North Carolina, and was, along with other professor slave holders, a founder of this congregation. So we have our own history here. And in that same church, a descendant of one of the enslaved people baptized there a century and a half later, as the first black woman Episcopal priest came to celebrate her first Eucharist as a priest in the very chapel where her ancestors as slaves had been baptized and sat in the slave gallery. So we live in a space that has shadows and secrets and powerful moments of pride. So we've witnessed both the shameful and, you might say, the triumphant, and I guess that's the stuff of life. So with that introduction, when you watch this, what thoughts come to mind for you, either about the specifics of the film itself or what it means to hear and listen and be exposed to these ideas as a clergy person in a church that has its own complicated and, may we say, unresolved history?
Thanks, David. Yeah. I think one of the main things that stands out right away is this idea of reconciliation, reconciliation, particularly in a Christian concept, is a key part of the Christian faith tradition. It is something that we're called to in our baptismal covenant in terms of rejecting evil and following God, in terms of respecting the dignity of every human being, of joining with God in the ministry of reconciliation. This idea that all of us are called to reconcile ourselves to God, reconcile ourselves to each other, and then somehow reconcile all things, reconcile ourselves with the world. And I think the obvious question is, what do you do when reconciliation seems impossible? I was saying to Tim before, during this screening, I noticed just how many times Jan says, I could not reconcile. I don't know if anyone else heard that. Talking about, I can't reconcile the person I knew my father to be with this fact, or I can't reconcile all of this silence with what I know about my family, this loving family that I had drawn up in my head. And so it's an important question, and I think it's an important question for Christians. I think it's an important question for us who are parishioners of the Chapel of the Cross, because some of that history that David just kind of ran through, we might feel a similar kind of impossibility of reconciliation, or for any of us in the room who maybe have families that are also tangled up in the history of slavery in the United States. What I would say, though, is this idea of the truth in and of itself. What stands out to me is what Jan did with insisting on telling the truth is in and of itself an act of reconciliation, in the sense that it is saying the true thing into the world. It is reconciling, sure, things in herself, but it is also bringing to light what actually happened. Another Christian conviction that the things that happen in the darkness will be brought to the light. And when you think about truth-telling, I think there's something, seems like psychologically for Jan, that was important about it. But to me, too, I was just struck by, to tell the truth is an inherently hopeful act. And even if you're not expecting or wanting something in return, which it feels like what Jan was saying, there's so many things that we might tell the truth about that someone might say, what is the point? It's only going to make things worse, or it's only going to stir things up, etc. To tell the truth is an inherently hopeful act, because it is pointing towards that time of reconciliation when all things will be reconciled together. It is pointing towards the realities that have happened, and there cannot be reconciliation with actually identifying all of the things that have fallen short. And the last thing that I think related with this is this idea of confession. What does it mean to confess? For any of you within the Episcopal tradition, there is almost never a service when we don't confess, whether it's a Eucharist on a Sunday or the daily office, if any of you keep it. I think sometimes we can just breeze right past those words without thinking about them. And at the same time, they are always there. It makes confession, to me, something that is both more weighty and a little bit less scary all at the same time, in that to confess is to repent is a practice of life. It is less a moment, it is less a discrete moment in time, and it is more like a constant, always turning back to that which we know is true. Always going back to the baptismal covenant and trying to live it out more fully. And that's what, at least to me, really then stuck out in the latter parts of the film, where Jan is then actually turning all of this inward and being like, well, wait a second, right? What does this have to do with me? What are the ways in which I have these blind spots? What are these ways in which I let my family off the hook? What are the ways I'm letting myself off the hook? And then what do I do about that? So those were the moments that stuck out.
And thank you for that, because I do think Jan makes this turn from trying to make sense of things, then to trying to see if and to try to confess publicly, but then I guess met with silence, or just as time evolves, she turns and says, but what I can do is look at myself and who I am, and that's a redemptive act, that's a hopeful act. And maybe one of the most courageous acts is to turn the questions that you might ask of somebody not you, to turn them on yourselves. So
Entirely,
she does become, I think, courageous is the wrong word, but an inspiring figure for daring to ask the hard question, who am I really? And so if the story prompts that, we'll talk more about the power of story and how important storytelling is in a time when stories are being suppressed. But the power here is each of us can ask ourselves these questions.
And I think it doesn't matter whether or not your family history or personal history is reflected in this film. And just, to share personally, growing up in New England, the way this manifested itself is, racism, that's a Southern problem, right? Like it's okay if you laugh. And like, this is how I grew up, right? Like, we didn't have that problem, Like, if we can talk in detail about how, like, actually Rhode Island was a key part of the slave trade, right? There's like so many ways in which this is wrong. And there were so many ways in which it was wrong, like personally for my family once I started paying attention more. And so this film, even though my history is not the same as Jan's, also reminded me of that part of my own story as well.
Good, thank you. So Tim, you are a person of faith who lived in a crucible society. I mean, you were there in South Africa where these issues of racial cruelty and the attempts at societal confession and redemption were lived out large. I don't know when you left, at what point those struggles were, but what does this film conjure up for you, make you think about? And given your particular history, and now sitting in a place that still has some work to do in areas that South Africa at least has begun that work boldly.
Yeah, thank you, David. I think the thing that sprung to mind primarily for me is the notion of historical injustice, that we're all born into social worlds that are marred by deep, powerful injustice. And as we're born into them, we didn't do anything to shape them. But if, like me, you're white and male, you probably end up on the top side of the deal. And what, to me, the film brought home so powerfully is the need for us to take a long and unflinching look at how racism depended on horrifying violence in every country that there was racial injustice. It's not a matter of people saying unkind words or a matter of people not liking other people. It's a matter of brutal violence visited upon black bodies because they're black bodies. And when I left South Africa, I left as a kind of draft dodger. All white men were required to serve in the apartheid army, and I had decided as a person of faith it was impossible for me to do that, but also as somebody involved in the anti-apartheid movement, which was such an inspiring thing to be involved in, because it was ordinary people saying effectively what Rosa Parks said, no. There was this beautiful slogan from the women in the 1950s when the pass laws were first made. Black people had to carry around a little identity document, not unlike what might soon be required of people here who are not born here. And they said, you have tampered with women, you have struck a rock. You have tampered with women, you've struck a rock. And it's that moment of the people saying, no, we will not go along with this. So there's that problem of historical injustice, and I think the need to take the unflinching look at the violence. But there's also a question for me about the structural element of historical injustice, that it's not just horrifying violence perpetrated by crowds or individuals upon other individuals, but it's a matter of how society's resources are distributed, of who gets to control the wealth and the land and the things that make life rich and worth living. And so to look at historical injustice requires a sort of a willingness to look at one's own complicity in it, but also to look with eyes of hope, right? Because there are signs always of resistance. There are signs of people standing up and saying, no. And the turnout this evening, how wonderful that people want to learn more, right? That there's a hunger for this. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission was founded by an act of the newly democratized Parliament in 1995, and it was set up with Archbishop Desmond Tutu, who was the Anglican Archbishop of Cape Town, presiding over it. And their mission was to look at grievous human rights violations that had occurred in the apartheid system, both perpetrated by the white minority, but also by the liberation movements. So it had to be looking at all acts of violence. And they went from small town to small town and picked up the stories of people who had lost family members, mostly black people who'd lost family members, tortured or disappeared by the security police. And it's a matter of recovering the stories, which is in a way what Jan is doing, is to get the story of what happened to our loved one that was never made known. And, you know, the old activist in me wants to say, and I hope nobody takes offense at this, but let's be aware of the moment we're in American history right now, with a government set hell-bent on distorting the fundamental truths about what this country is like. And a government that is addicted to lies, that constantly distorts the truth. And our challenge as citizens, I'm a naturalized citizen, I'm having a bit of buyer's remorse on that score, but I think our challenge is to ask ourselves, what is it to be truthful about what's happening in our country and about our responses to it? How do we stand together with the people who are bearing the brunt of what's happening, knowing, though, that, you know, anybody could be next, right? That's how authoritarian regimes work. And I grew up in a Christian nationalist authoritarian regime. I can tell you it's not pretty. And so we need to stand up and we need to be clear about where the lines are that we're not willing to be pulled beyond. So I think I'll leave it there for now.
Thank you. So I've got one more question, and then we're gonna open this up. I can't believe it. I'm actually feeling somewhat hopeful. Really? And well, I'm hopeful here because there's a notion that a wonderful sociologist, Arlie Hochschild, who's written a lot about oppressive cultures in the United States, talks about, and the term is structural amnesia. The sense that when a culture decides to deliberately and selectively forget certain truths because they are inconvenient and they might challenge the structures of power. And the South is beset, America, but the South in particular, when it comes to race, has mastered the perpetuation of structural amnesia. But there was something Tim said, and I love this brief description of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the ability to gather stories and to magnify those stories and to collect them. The Rosa Parks moment maybe of aggregating stories so that they, in their aggregation of truth, they are that much harder to deny. And the hope I have is, Susanna, coming back to you, the gift of storytelling with someone as a central character, as candid and courageous and modest and as Jan. Jan really emerges for me as an avatar of what it takes. She told the truth, she held the mirror up, and she did not shrivel up and die. In times like this, there may be actual hope in that. So I don't know if any of you want to make a response to that. This is a hallelujah to the capturing of stories, and capturing of stories in such a way that they allow truth and courage to shine. I think that's what you've done. Do you think that's what you've done? I don't know. Thoughts or comments about that. I think this issue, we are under the weight of structural amnesia, and we do have powers and principalities who would be happy if the miasma of structural amnesia was persistent, and therefore we chip away at history and truth so that reality becomes the amnesiac state, and we can't let that happen. So hooray for confession, hooray for filmmaking. Final thoughts from our panel before we turn it to y'all. Want to say anything?
General thoughts?
Mm-hmm. General thoughts.
There's one thing, I mean, this might come up in the Q&A, but no, it won't, because I'm going to answer it preemptively. But one of the things that there were two really significant moments in this film for me, elements of it. One was finding the difference between apology and accountability, because she didn't want it to be an apology in that I'm sorry and so therefore you need to forgive me. And we you know, it was kind of a matter of language for getting that across in the film, but it was really important that to make it clear that it's not the whole concept of white guilt, and how do you make this not about white guilt, and how does it not ask for forgiveness from black people and make the black people do the work to make the white people feel better. So that was one thing that was really important, was framing it as acknowledgement of what happened rather than an apology requesting some kind of forgiveness. The other thing was, you know, as Jan experienced, I experienced as a white person this, you know, shock and horror about finding this out. How could this happen? But so many of my black friends and colleagues, because of course as a filmmaker you show your work to other filmmakers and non-filmmakers, but along the way to like get a sense of how it's landing with audiences and of different kinds. And I had, for instance, one really important person to get feedback from is a black male documentary filmmaker, friend of mine. His name is Keith McWhorter. And along the way I got the feedback from him, and he said, well, you know, this is really important, and I'm glad you're making it. It's really well done, but I'm not your audience. He said, I know all this. He said, I am so tired of trying to talk to my white friends about racism. You guys have to talk to each other about it. It's time for white people to talk to each other about it. But then I didn't just want it, I didn't want it to exist in that kind of state of ignorance of like, oh, we white people, like, this is so horrible, but how do you bridge that gap? And so that was when we got to her finding a way for her to acknowledge that she gets that. You know, so we brought that element kind of late. It was a matter of learning that and getting to that for me. It's like, oh, okay, wait. So why are we so naive about it? And black people know so much about it and know the story. It's because that's what black people have had to live to, you know, stay alive. And white people were just like oblivious because we're not in danger. Anyway, what she ended up saying about we haven't had to know horrors of what we've done because we weren't the ones getting killed. So it was really important to me, and I think that was a key storytelling moment and filmmaking moment for me. I couldn't let it out in the world without addressing that fact. And I think that, and so those were kind of the two big storytelling moments of how do you tell a story and what are the elements that have to go into the story to make it say what it needs to say.
And I'm going to come back to Father Keith just to, because it strikes me, you say Episcopalians do a pretty good job in confessing.
At least liturgically.
Liturgically. But we have this prayer, the general confession, and it strikes me, if I remember it properly, it's in the first person plural. It's not in the first person singular. It's not, I have done these things. It's we have. And to the act of saying those words as individuals in a communal sense, to me, elevates the fact that there's a personal dimension to all these, but there also is a social and communal. And when it becomes social and communal, that's the step to it being systemic. So being able to name not just me, but us, keeping that awareness may be part of what all our work is, whether we confess here Sundays or come from other traditions or just as we live our lives, that it's me plus you is us.
And to Tim's point about structures we're born into, there's some forms of confession that even recognize sins done on our behalf, right? Things that we can feel as if we're like, when we think about our atomized self, very removed from, but when we take, I think, a clear and honest look, we can recognize it's more complicated than that. I was really struck, Susanna, by the editing change about getting rid of the Klan, right? And that to me makes me think of like the good news and the bad news is that there are no monsters. There's just people. And that's good news because it's good that there are other humans. There is always that light in another person to recognize. I mean, the bad news then is we can't just dismiss people as monsters, right? Like that would be very, very convenient. And theologically, and particularly as Christians, it is always to recognize the other, no matter what despicable thing that they have done to us or to others, as still bearing the divine stamp of God, right? And that makes these things incredibly difficult. And I think it actually makes it more difficult than if there were just monsters. And it makes us do the work with ourselves, with our families, with our communities, that we otherwise would not have to do if we could just blame everything on the monsters. And just to what some people have said about responsibility or accountability, I would just add that in my work here at the church, before that I worked on college campuses as an administrator who worked with college students, and in that work with young people. I think that so many of us, particularly young people, but in my ministries, we are so hungry for people who are real, for people who are truthful, for people who are responsible and not just making excuses or not just constantly attacking the other side. People who, right, to reference Jesus, right, aren't just pointing out the log in other people's eye, but will pointing out the speck in the other person's eye and recognizing the log in their own. I think that the nihilism and the cynicism that has just kind of really, I think, descended on our society in recent years means that can feel oppressive, but it means like when there's something that is not that, it just shines. And I think it really strikes us, and I think people are really hungry for that. And that is something that always encourages me to take responsibility and be accountable.
And I think Jan is the voice of that, and we thank you for it. So folks, you probably have questions, and we have microphones. So Boykin's gonna, yes, thank you. And say, if you'd like, if you can, say who you are so we know who you are. That would be lovely. Thank you.
Well, I'm Beth Crow, and first my question was going to go to you and really to Jan, but as I listened to the whole conversation, I'm focused first on Tim, and I had the privilege of being in South Africa and meeting a Father Michael Lapsley. Do you know Mr. Lapsley? He was involved in the Truth and Reconciliation process, and met with the young people that I took to South Africa as part of the diocesan program, and he talked a lot about forgiveness. And he's written a book called Redeeming the Past, if anybody's interested. He's a very profound speaker, Anglican priest that went to South Africa and said, I quit becoming a human and became a white man because how oppressive things were. But my question comes back then to, how does Jan get forgiveness when her father's gone? How does she heal now from, I just feel this torment in her from the image of this loving father she had to now this other image. And I keep thinking of things Father Michael Lapsley said to us about, the importance of the storytelling. So she's heard the story now, but how does she get that healing and that forgiveness? I mean, I have my own concept. So in a way, the three of you tie together. How can Jan let go and have forgiveness when her father's not here anymore?
Good question. I think I want to answer the question maybe at two levels. Just at the human psychological level, it goes back to what David was saying about integration, becoming a person of integrity. Because I think one of the reasons why there's been such a backlash, political backlash against the Black Lives Matter movement is that the way it was portrayed in the popular press made white people who hadn't thought about these things much feel guilt and shame, and nobody wants to feel those. It's not about guilt and shame, it's about responsibility. It's about acknowledging that you have advantages that you don't deserve, that other people lack, and therefore are advantages that are exploitative because they work to the disadvantage of others. That's the fundamental point. So it's the moment of integrity. But then the other part of the answer that I want to give is a Christian answer, which is the cross is not a pretty sight. If you didn't know what the cross was, and somebody, you were new to the religion, and you said, well, why do you have this little design and somebody said, actually, the design is a very simplified one. We'll show you the real one is a naked man tormented to death on an instrument of torture by an empire. That's what we worship in our religion. You'd be horrified. I mean, you'd run for the door, right? And the story of Christianity is there is what looks like wholly unabsorbed suffering, and the answer is the resurrection, that there's always something new comes out of that death. We don't know always what that is. We're in the period of waiting, often hundreds of years, but we have to have the hope and the trust that something new will come from these horrors, and that evil does not have the last word, because the incarnation is the story of a God who becomes vulnerable and says, yes, I will undergo this suffering because that's what the human condition looks like, and I will redeem that condition. So that, I don't know if that's at all helpful.
Do you want to say more? I just want to say something about that, which will not come anywhere near the level of what Tim just said. It'll be very kind of mundane. But I think, I'm not sure forgiving who you're talking about, if forgiveness for herself or forgiving her father, but I think she's not seeking any forgiveness for herself. She is trying to find a way to forgive her father and therefore be able to live with this. And I think that what she has come to, which I hope the film also conveys, even if it's just kind of subconsciously, is that she can forgive him because he's human. And we all carry light and darkness inside of us. We're all capable of good things and bad things. And for a long time she tried to justify it, and I think she's gone from justification to acceptance in a way, and letting go of trying to make some kind of intellectual, logical sense of it, and just being able to carry him in her heart despite that action in his life. Boykin's got the microphone back there.
Hi, I'm Florence Nash, and I have, for Susanna, this is back to the mundane, but this, I think, is not entirely unrelated to what we've just been talking about. I would love to know what that conversation was. What was the context of the conversation between Jan and her uncle, her father's brother, when he told her about this? Did he tell her that as his own unloading, or did he tell her as a challenge? What do you know about that?
From what I understood, so first he told her brother. Her brother went to the funeral of the aunt whose brother-in-law had been the victim of the murder that set all this off. So I think because in the context of her funeral, and the story was the family she married into, it came up, and he told the story somehow, and he told it in a very offhand way. And Jan's brother was like horrified, and he called Jan immediately and said, "You won't believe what Uncle Robert just told me." So then when Jan saw him next and asked him about it, she was, as she said, I think she was probably pretty timid because she didn't want to, poke the bear. And when he said justice was done, she realized that he was still in that frame of mind, and she just couldn't go anywhere with that. And, I think that's been a lot of it too, is that, if her uncle had said, "I know it's horrible and we all felt terrible about it and I've wrestled with this," maybe it would have been an easier road for her, and she could have gone, okay, she wouldn't have felt so alone in her search for some kind of, understanding. So that added to the pain for her, that he felt that way too.
Yeah, thank you.
I'm Lynn Buggage. First of all, Susanna, thank you for a wonderful film. And along the same line of this conversation we're having, one of the things that crossed my mind was Jan's search for names. I'm wondering if you explored that with her, about why she was so steadfast in seeking names, and whether or not you explored, so what would have happened if she found names?
Well, if she had found other people's names and not her father's name, then she could have believed that he didn't actually do it, because there's no hardcore proof. I mean, it's the family story, and it makes sense because it was a family issue, and the men in the family would have done that. And he was, 18 years old, and he didn't instigate it himself, but he went along with it. And so that's what she was hoping, was that they'd name the lynchers, and her father wouldn't be there, and then she could go, "Oh, okay, he didn't have anything to do with it. I don't have to feel so bad." But that didn't happen, and that led her to the realization of the protection of the perpetrators and of the white people, and how that secrecy, that, as she says, the looking away, it's like, okay, we're just going to pretend this didn't happen. We don't have to, it wasn't done by actual people we have the names of. It's just like, let's cover it over. Same thing with the photographer, like he protected. So that was an understanding she came to in the quest for wanting to find the proof of what happened, so she could really say, no, it wasn't him.
Got it. Thank you.
Right back here, and somebody up front.
My name is Susan Delaney, and I just want to make a couple comments about the film. In that yearbook where the name Frasers were, there was a custom that you named your slaves after your name. So she was more than likely, if she took her history way back, her family was slave owners of all those people she went to school with. We know this because we found it out in our own family. Hudson had been a slave owner, and we found a woman who was a descendant of that slave, that family. And then the other part, let's see. Oh, so it was interesting that she thought about the reunion, that they had two separate reunions, one for white people and the other for black people. And I loved what she said. Boy, was I naive, because I thought we were all kind of together in high school and everything was together. And I would just like to say, white people, we are incredibly naive about what is going on. So my office manager is African American, and we have some very intense talks. And when George Floyd was murdered, I said to her, that was really terrible. And she looked at me and said, that happens every day. This was just caught on film. And so, yeah, there's a lot of naivety that we live in about I bet everybody in here probably had slave owners. And it's so prevalent. And we all grew up kind of thinking this wasn't happening. It is happening still. So
That is very true, and it's something that I hope the film will raise for people, that her naivete, a lot. I mean, I grew up in the Northeast and New England, and again, thinking I wasn't racist, and there were like 2 black kids in my school, and of course they behaved well and and everything seemed fine, and just like Jan, I mean, it was a realization to me of that for me too, that all of that. But also, I just want to say that my father's from the South. His family is actually from North Carolina. My grandfather went to NC State, and his grandmother owned slaves. And I know about the name thing because he told me this, and it became. I was aware that any time in fact, my father met a young black woman whose last name was Styron at an event, and she came up to him, and they talked about the fact that her family had probably been slaves of his family. So yes, I carry that too in my family, and I'm aware of that.
My name is Jeff Dennis, and as you can tell from my accent, I'm actually not from around here. But what I wanted to ask is, what thing struck me in the film is how, I think you said a couple of times, she said a couple of times, Jan said a couple of times, how her father had been very kind to her, and her relationship with her mother was less good. Was there any suggestion at any point that she thought that, and maybe this would have to be in retrospect, of course, that her father was very nice to her because in some sense this was one way that he was repenting for what happened? We don't know, of course, nobody knows whether, quote unquote, he took an active role in this lynching, and I'm sure a large number of people who were there didn't take a quote unquote active role. But it makes you wonder whether he came away from that and thought, this was a really bad thing to do, so I'm now going to try to be better. Do you see what I'm saying?
I do see what you're saying. It's hard for me to think that human nature kind of really works that way, that you can do a bad thing and then suddenly you can be a nice person. And I think part of the point is that he was a nice guy. And he did this anyway, and that's the whole thing about it. It wasn't just, families would go to these things. It wasn't the Klan. It was people who, love their children and are teachers and are, librarians and whatever, who have families. And, but I will say he did join the Navy right after the lynching. And to me, that I've always wondered if he left because it was so horrible. He was like, I got to get out of here and get out of this. I mean, he stayed in the South, but it was Miami. So that, I think both of those things were in play.
There's another curious thing, too, about the father. I mean, I had a conversation with a friend who may be here, and I thought about it here. The father did not object, it seems, to his daughter going to a school that was being integrated. I mean, that was a big deal. For a lot of people, that would say, I'm out of here. I'm putting my child in a private academy, even if I can't afford. So there's something curious. There's something curious that maybe he was ill, because it seems like he died right after that. But the lack of protest about his daughter going to a school does that? I'll ask the question. Does that mean that there was something short of total animus toward black people? What does it mean? Did she ever talk about that? Because it seemed to be a comfortable socialization. Maybe she's misreading it, or is that the next film?
No, as you might imagine, when you make a documentary film, you've heard of the proverbial cutting room floor. There is more stuff you leave out than you put in. There was a lot about that this was originally much longer, and there was a choice I made to keep it to this small of a story. And I could have branched out and done all sorts of things. But anyway, what is not in here, but is on film, I have on film, is when we were talking, is her mother was quite racist. And wouldn't, she in weird, her mother was a little crazy, as she conveyed, and I left that part in about her mother to give a sense of how much she needed her father and his kindness and his protection, and how important that was to her growing up. But her mother would not touch something that a black person had touched. It was weird. He was an appliance repairman. He could not have sent his daughter to private school. He did not exhibit openly racist tendencies like her mother did at all. But when she liked a boy who was black and wanted him to be her boyfriend, her parents would not tolerate that. That was not okay. So there were all these details about that could have been, it won't be the next film, but it could have been a different film that this was, but I chose to not go there.
Yeah. Let's take one more question, because we want to have a little, if there's still a cookie out there, because some of you may want to just say something to our panelists, and we want to make space for that. Yes, thank you.
My question, thank you, Susanna, is similar to what you just said. I'm interested in the secretive nature of the family secret aspect of this, and it was mentioned in the written description of the film. And I'm wondering whether you have any information as to whether, she ever talked with her father about, about racism, about black people, about anything like that, because I wonder if he would have said to her, I did a bad thing when I was younger, and as painful as that might have been for her to hear, perhaps that element of deep betrayal and confusion would have been lessened for her throughout the rest of her life. And I do understand, that might be a part of the times and the society they were in, but I'm just curious as to whether you have any information about that.
Well, she talks about that. I mean, she was 18 when he died. She didn't find out about this family secret until long after he was gone. So she couldn't talk to him about it. But that's what kind of like that, what the To Kill a Mockingbird scene is about, is her imagining how it might have gone if she had been able to ask him. And, nobody knows, and she'll never know, but all she can do is imagine the man she knew, what happened. I mean, I thought about it a lot when I was making the film. I imagine he probably felt a lot of shame about it and just wanted to put it away as if it had never happened, and that's why he never talked about it. So that's all, that's all we can know. And that's the thing about finding it out when they're gone and you can't talk to them about it. When you find out something awful about somebody you love and you can't go, what were you thinking? Like, let's talk about this. So she just has to live with that, with her imagination of it.
Asking an exception to the questions being
Okay. All right.
So I admit I was just doing some Googling. My question before I get to that is, I'm sorry. My question, just to get to the point, is maybe this was no big deal to him. The population of Montgomery County was 14,000 in 1950. I was just looking this up. Half of that was black. And 150 people show up in Duck Hill, which I know because it's spent my summers in Winona, Mississippi. And this was probably it very well may not have been a big deal to him because every white person was a part of this. 150 people showing up in Duck Hill in 1936 is the whole white population probably, or half of it. You know what, am I totally off base here?
Well, I don't know. You would know better than I do. You just Googled it.
Well, not just the number. That's just numbers, but
yeah.
It's a tiny place.
Yeah. I mean, I think people came from, it was in the county courthouse in Winona. So that's where it all happened. So I think, and then they took them to, the thing had happened, and the murder of the white guy had happened in Duck Hill. They took him from the courthouse in Winona. So it was kind of like a countywide thing. I think word probably spread. I don't know for sure, but I'm going to imagine. But anyway, even if it was that, yes, your point that maybe it wasn't a big deal to him and he never thought about it again. And then maybe that's why the uncle was just like, oh, we forgot to tell you this story, but now I'm going to tell you now that your aunt died. And justice was done. Maybe it was, you're right, maybe it was no big deal. But
I guess
we'll
what I'm
never
saying
know.
that for that small number of people with 150 people showing up, that was a community event for the white population.
Yeah. But it was in so
And
many
half of them- and
places
half of
where
them
there were
probably were
lynchings.
the
I mean, isn't that true? Where there, well, at so many lynchings, it was like the entire all the white people that could get there would get there and have picnics and bring their kids.
And I think just the other thing we could be here and talk about this forever. You're in a small town. You're black. The white people own everything. You speak out, you could be the next one. You could lose your job. So the power, the cultural and power dynamics that are present then they are disfiguring. And what we are seeing is a story that's emerging out of that disfiguring and disfigured environment. So there's certain mysteries. Yes, you see violence, you're either going to go silent or maybe you're just going to go along because the price of not going along, which is another backstory here, is so immense. And so, for me, this comes back to the divided self, that Jan, for herself, says, I have to bring an end to this fact of just going along because I can't live this way anymore. So there are lots of layers. We're going to wrap this up and say, Susanna, in 20 minutes, you've given us a powerful story, a heck of a lot to think about, a heck of a lot to think about in ourselves, a heck of a lot to think about in our culture, a heck of a lot to think about in a contemporary world that seems to be suppressing rather than elevating unpleasant and inconvenient stories. So our gratitude to you and to this panel for giving us a lot to think about.
And thank you very much.